When Samantha and Jake found the Victorian-era house on the outskirts of town, it felt like fate. After years of saving, they finally had enough to buy a home of their own, and the price for this house seemed almost too good to be true. The real estate agent mentioned that it needed some work, but they loved the charm of the old place, with its creaky floors, tall ceilings, and intricate woodwork. The house was spacious, with a grand entryway, 4 bedrooms, and a wide attic. But the part that excited them most was the basement, which the agent called perfect for storage. It was a bit dusty and dimly lit, but they saw the potential for turning it into a workshop or a game room someday. There were a few strange quirks, like doors that didn't quite line up with the walls and a couple of odd bulges in the wallpaper, but they chalked it up to the house's age. After they moved in, life felt like a dream. The first couple of weeks were spent painting, unpacking, and making the place their own, but there was always a strange feeling, a sensation that they weren't truly alone. Samantha dismissed it as just being unsettled in a new, unfamiliar house, but the sensation nagged at her, like she was being watched from the corners of rooms, shadows moving just beyond her vision. Then, one evening while Jake was out for work, Samantha decided to clean up the basement and make a proper start at organizing it. As she swept the dusty floor, she noticed that one wall seemed out of place, as if it had been built hastily. It had a faint, uneven bulge in the plaster. Curious, she tapped on the wall, and the hollow sound that came back made her heart race. She called Jake, and together they decided to investigate. After prying off some of the plaster, they discovered an old, narrow wooden door hidden behind it. The door was painted the same shade as the walls, blending in almost perfectly. There was no handle, just a rusted keyhole that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Jake grabbed a crowbar, and after some effort, they managed to pry open the door. It creaked, a long, eerie sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Inside, there was a small, cramped room, no bigger than a walk-in closet. The air that wafted out was stale and bitter, carrying the scent of something that had been shut away for a long time. The room was empty except for a small wooden table with a single chair, both covered in a thick layer of dust. In the middle of the table sat an old notebook, its leather cover cracked and faded. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling on a fraying wire. When Jake flipped the switch, the bulb flickered to life, casting jittery shadows that made the room feel colder than it already was. Samantha opened the notebook, and they both froze at the first page. "I found it again. I sealed it, but it won't stay hidden." Page after page, the notebook detailed the writings of a previous owner, a man named Harold, who seemed obsessed with the room and the strange occurrences he experienced after discovering it. He wrote about how he'd heard whispers at night, voices urging him to open the door again, to free whatever was behind the walls. One entry, dated July 17, 1953, sent chills down Samantha's spine. "The shadows move when I'm not looking. They call my name. They know I found their prison." The last few pages were scribbled in a frantic, nearly illegible scrawl. "I had to lock her in. She wouldn't stop smiling. She kept saying it was almost time, that they were coming for her, for us all." Jake's unease grew. "Maybe it's just a joke," he said, trying to reassure Samantha, but his own voice wavered. They decided to reseal the hidden door that night, nailing it shut and placing a heavy bookshelf in front of it. But the uneasy feeling lingered, even after they left the basement. It was as if they had disturbed something that was better left alone. That night, Samantha woke up to a sound, a low, rhythmic thumping. She shook Jake awake, and they both listened, realizing that it was coming from beneath them. From the basement. Jake grabbed a flashlight, and they hesitantly made their way downstairs. The sound grew louder as they reached the hidden door, now concealed behind the bookshelf. It sounded like someone was knocking from the other side, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if they were trying to communicate. With a deep breath, Jake moved the bookshelf aside. The knocking stopped. He held the flashlight steady while Samantha tried to convince him to leave it alone. But before they could decide, the door creaked open a fraction on its own, revealing the darkness beyond. Samantha shone the flashlight into the room, but what they saw made their blood run cold. The chair was no longer empty. A shadowy figure sat hunched over the table, its back turned to them. It was the shape of a woman, her hair long and matted, her frame gaunt and unnatural. She turned her head slowly, impossibly, until her face was twisted all the way around to stare directly at them. Her mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, lips pulled back to reveal teeth too sharp, too numerous. Her eyes were pitch black, hollow and endless. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, she vanished. But her voice remained, a whisper that seemed to come from the very walls around them. You shouldn't have opened it. Now I can't leave until you stay. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire basement, and the nails they had hammered in earlier flew from the frame, clattering to the floor. The thumping returned, now echoing through the house, like dozens of footsteps running up and down the halls. They ran upstairs, but no matter how many locks they turned, the sound of footsteps and whispers filled the air. Every corner seemed to hide her shadow, every room felt colder, like a presence was just out of sight, waiting. They left the house that night, abandoning everything, driving until they reached a nearby motel. But when Samantha woke up in the middle of the night, she found a dusty, weathered notebook lying on the pillow beside her. Its pages were blank except for one new entry, written in a trembling hand: "You can't keep it hidden forever." To this day, they haven't returned to the house. But sometimes, late at night, when they think they hear a soft tapping on their motel door or a whisper in the wind, they know she's still searching, still waiting for them to come back and finish what they started. When Emily and her husband, Mark, moved into the small, quaint town of Hawthorne, they were excited about the fresh start. The town was quiet, surrounded by thick woods, and felt like a perfect escape from their hectic city lives. They managed to buy an old house on the edge of town. Its faded red bricks and ivy-covered walls spoke of history, and they envisioned it as a peaceful retreat. The previous owner, an elderly woman who had lived there alone for years, had passed away under mysterious circumstances. The real estate agent downplayed it as old age, but there were whispers among the townsfolk that she had grown obsessed with the house's strange sounds, claiming to hear things at night that no one else could. Emily brushed off the gossip as small-town superstition, eager to settle into their new home. From the start, the house had a peculiar feel. The floors creaked more than they should have, and the old wooden walls seemed to groan and sigh, as if adjusting to the presence of new occupants. But the oddest thing was a door they found in the back of the house, tucked behind a wardrobe in the study. It was small, barely 4 feet high, and looked like it had been boarded up and then hastily reopened. Emily was intrigued, and despite Mark's reservations, she insisted they explore what was behind it. They pried the door open with a crowbar, revealing a hidden staircase descending into darkness. A damp, earthy smell rose from below, mingling with the stale air. Holding hands, they slowly made their way down the creaky steps, flashlight beams cutting through the shadows. At the bottom of the stairs was a room with a dirt floor and stone walls, barely large enough to fit a single bed. There was an old iron bed frame against one wall, covered in cobwebs, and a wooden rocking chair in the corner. Emily shivered. It looked like a makeshift bedroom, but there was something deeply unsettling about the confined space. A heavy silence pressed in around them, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into a place that wasn't meant to be found. They decided to leave the hidden room alone for now, nailing the door shut again. But after that night, things started to change. Emily began to hear noises at night, faint, muffled whispers that seemed to seep through the walls, like a distant conversation she couldn't quite make out. At first, she thought it was the wind, or the old pipes clanging in the walls. But as the days went by, the whispers grew louder, turning into soft laughter and weeping. She'd hear it while brushing her teeth, or when she was alone in bed, Mark snoring beside her, oblivious to the eerie sounds. One night, she woke to the sound of the rocking chair creaking, its rhythmic squeak drifting up through the floorboards. Emily crept downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest, and put her ear to the study door. She swore she could hear someone humming a tune from the other side of the sealed door. She woke Mark, but he dismissed it, claiming it was just the house settling. But as Emily pressed her ear against the door again, she heard it clearly, a voice, old and cracked, whispering, "I never left. I never left." She stepped back, her skin crawling, and urged Mark to check the hidden room with her again. Reluctantly, he agreed, and they pried open the nailed door together. The air that greeted them was colder than before, the scent of earth and decay stronger. They went down the stairs, and to their horror, the rocking chair was now in the center of the room, facing them, as if waiting. On the bed frame was an old, weathered journal. Emily picked it up, her hands shaking, and flipped through the yellowed pages. It belonged to the elderly woman who had lived in the house. Her final entries spoke of a presence that lived beneath the house, one that had once been sealed away behind the walls. The last entry read, "I hear her at night. She wants me to come down, to sit with her. She says she's lonely. But I know if I go, I won't return." I sealed her in, but the whispers never stopped. The chair creaked again, and Emily dropped the journal, her heart racing. She felt a presence behind her, cold air brushing against the back of her neck. Mark spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but there was no one there. They ran up the stairs, sealing the door with nails and furniture. But as the days passed, the whispers grew more insistent, turning into frantic banging and scratching, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Every night, the rocking chair's creak filled their dreams, a rhythmic back and forth that drove them to the edge of sanity. One night, when the banging was at its loudest, Mark broke down and decided to confront whatever was down there. He grabbed a hammer and pried open the door again, ignoring Emily's pleas to leave it alone. She followed him down, both of them trembling with fear. The room was dark, the rocking chair still in the center. But this time, something sat in it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, its face obscured by a veil of long, tangled hair. As Mark shone the flashlight on it, the figure slowly turned its head, revealing a face that looked like it had been buried for decades, skin tight and gray over its skull, eyes empty sockets. It smiled, teeth too white, too sharp. And then it lunged. The flashlight dropped, plunging them into darkness as Emily heard Mark's scream turn into a wet, gurgling sound. She stumbled back, her hand frantically searching for the staircase, but the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, trapping her inside. She fumbled in the dark, her fingers brushing against the journal, and in a desperate moment, she understood. The elderly woman had never left the house. She had sealed herself down there, trying to contain whatever had been locked away in that room, and now it wanted out. Emily managed to wrench the door open and scramble up the stairs, leaving the room behind. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, but the silence in the house had changed. There were no more whispers, no more creaks. It was as if the house had finally exhaled. She drove through the night, not stopping until she reached the next town, but she never saw Mark again. When the authorities investigated, they found the house empty, the hidden room sealed shut from the inside. The journal, the rocking chair, and the bed frame were gone, as if they had never existed. And yet, on quiet nights, when she's alone in her new apartment, Emily can still hear the faintest sound, like the creak of a rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth, carrying with it the promise of something waiting to be found. Tom and Lisa had been saving up for years, dreaming of a place far away from the city chaos. When they finally bought a small house in Maple Hollow, a sleepy little town with only a few hundred residents, it seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the neighbors friendly, and the house, though old and in need of some care, had a certain charm with its rustic wood floors and ivy-covered porch. But the real estate agent seemed almost too eager to sell it, offering it at a much lower price than they expected. Their first night in the house was uneventful. Tom and Lisa unpacked their boxes, had pizza on the floor of their new living room, and collapsed into bed, exhausted but happy. But the next day, while they were sorting through the clutter left by the previous owner, Lisa discovered something odd. Behind a large, dusty bookshelf in the basement, she found a small door she hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away in a shadowy corner, made of thick, heavy wood with an old iron lock. The lock was broken, rusted through, as if it had been forced open long ago. Tom joined her, intrigued, and they both decided to see what was inside. They pushed the door open, revealing a narrow passageway that led deeper into the basement than they had realized. At the end of the passage, they found a room. It wasn't large, barely bigger than a walk-in closet, but the sight of it sent a shiver down Lisa's spine. The room had no windows, and the walls were lined with old, peeling floral wallpaper. A small cot with a thin, moldy mattress sat in one corner, next to a rickety wooden chair. In the opposite corner, there was a single, dusty toy, a wooden rocking horse, its paint faded and peeling. Tom joked that it was probably a kid's secret hideout, but Lisa wasn't so sure. The room felt wrong. The air was cold, and the musty smell was thick enough to make her gag. They decided to leave the room alone, closing the door and pushing the bookshelf back in place. But that night, Lisa couldn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, listening to the old house settle around them. Around 2 a.m., just as she was finally drifting off, she heard a sound, a faint scraping, like nails dragging across wood. She nudged Tom awake, but he shrugged it off, groggily mumbling about old houses and noisy pipes. The next morning, they found the basement door ajar. Lisa insisted she had closed it before bed, but Tom laughed it off, calling her paranoid. Yet that night, it happened again, this time, with footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing up from the basement. Lisa was sure she heard a child's voice, whispering too low for her to understand, but again, Tom found nothing. The unease settled into their lives, the days passing in a blur of unpacking and trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping through the house. Tom tried to keep the mood light, but even he seemed to grow tense at night, especially after he found the basement door open again, this time with deep scratches etched into its wood. One evening, Lisa decided she couldn't take it anymore. She convinced Tom that they needed to seal the hidden room properly, maybe even get a professional to come out and check the basement. Tom reluctantly agreed, and they moved the bookshelf aside once more. But when they opened the small door, they found the room in disarray. The cot had been overturned, and the rocking horse sat in the middle of the floor, its head turned toward the door as if waiting for them. On the walls, words had been scratched into the peeling wallpaper, "I'm still here." Lisa screamed, stumbling back into Tom's arms, her heart racing. Tom slammed the door shut, but before they could react further, they heard it, a laugh, high-pitched and childlike, coming from inside the room. They fled the basement and called the local police. An officer came out to inspect the house, but by the time he arrived, the scratches were gone, the rocking horse back in its corner, and the room looked undisturbed. The officer, a local who had lived in Maple Hollow all his life, stared at them with a mix of pity and frustration. "Didn't they tell you about this house before you bought it?" he asked, frowning. Tom and Lisa shook their heads, confused. The officer sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Years ago, a family lived here. They kept their youngest child down in that room, said he was too sick to be seen. He died down there, and no one ever found out why. They say his spirit never left." After the officer left, Tom and Lisa sat in silence, their faces pale. They didn't sleep that night, but lay awake, holding each other, listening to the creaks and groans of the house. The laughter didn't return, but they could feel a presence in the air, watching, waiting. The next day, they put the house up for sale. But in a town like Maple Hollow, news travels fast. No one was interested in a home with a haunted past. They stayed, hoping the unease would fade, but it only got worse. The laughter came back, louder than before, and they began finding toys from their own childhood, things that had been packed away in storage, scattered across the basement floor. The hidden room's door would stand open every morning, no matter how many times they sealed it shut. One night, as they sat in the living room, they heard a soft thump upstairs. Then, slowly, the sound of something rolling across the floor, like a ball. But when they went to check, they found a small, dusty teddy bear sitting at the top of the stairs, its button eyes staring blankly at them. Desperation turned to terror. They decided to flee, packing their things in the middle of the night. As they loaded the last of their boxes into the car, Lisa glanced back at the house one final time. In the upstairs window, she saw a small shadow, standing still, watching them leave. But as they drove away, the last sound they heard was a child's voice, drifting through the cold night air, whispering with a promise they would never forget, "You can't leave me. I'll find you." They moved far from Maple Hollow, but the house's curse followed them. Their new home was modern, bright, with no history of hauntings, yet every night, they heard the same creaking sound of a rocking horse, faint but unmistakable. And sometimes, in the dark corners of their bedroom, they would find a small toy, one that they had left behind in that hidden room. No matter where they go, the laughter follows. And Lisa now understands the truth: some rooms aren't meant to be found, and some spirits refuse to be forgotten. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.